She was just refilling water glasses beneath the golden light of the crystal chandeliers when the billionaire's son stood, staggered, then collapsed beside table 7. Guests gasped. She rushed forward on instinct and dropped to her knees. As she pressed her fingers to his wrist and whispered calm into the chaos, her eyes froze. There, on his hand, glinted a tarnished silver ring. Not just any ring, the one she had lost as a child, the one her father said vanished the day their house burned down. Her breath caught. Her past was sitting right there on the hand of a stranger whose world was nothing like hers, and in that moment she knew this was no accident. It was the beginning of everything. The room glittered with soft candlelight and polished silverware, the delicate clink of cutlery on porcelain abruptly silenced by the sharp gasp of a woman at table 5. Chairs scraped back, someone shouted for help. The restaurant manager stepped forward, calm but urgent, raising his voice just enough to ask everyone to remain seated. Amid the ripple of murmurs and half-stood guests, Ava was already moving, her tray clattering to the floor beside her. She dropped to her knees beside the young man who had collapsed, his suit crisp, his skin pale, his breath shallow. Her fingers, practiced from years of caregiving, searched for a pulse, steadying themselves, though her chest felt like it was unravelling. She called out for someone to bring water, but her eyes were no longer on his face. They were fixed on the ring that rested quietly on his right hand, silver, scratched, unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. A tremble started in her wrists and moved up her arms as the world around her blurred. That ring, it could not be the same. It could not be the one her father gave her when she was a child, the one she wore always until the fire took everything. But it was. Every groove and twist, the tiny star etched beneath the stone, even the slight bend near the base. It was impossible, and yet it was there, calmly resting on the finger of a stranger whose name she did not yet know. The chandeliers glittered overhead as if mocking her disbelief, their golden light casting soft shadows across white linen and shocked faces. Jazz music, which had moments earlier floated warmly across the room, now seemed garish, dissonant. Someone knelt beside her. The paramedics had arrived. They moved in quick, efficient motions, speaking to one another in clipped tones as they assessed the man and lifted him onto a gurney. Ava stood slowly, her apron smeared with water and wine, her lips slightly parted as if words might still come, but there were none. As the gurney rolled past her, she followed with her eyes only, watching the ring as it disappeared through the wide double doors and out of her world again. The manager approached her gently, asking if she was all right, but she barely registered his voice. She nodded. Her body nodded. Inside, something was burning again. The flames of memory. A room filled with smoke. A scream. The ring falling through her fingers as someone pulled her out into the night. She had thought it lost, like everything else from before. The laughter, her father's voice, her mother's perfume, all gone in a single night of ash and silence. But now, here it was again. The mystery she had buried had just resurfaced, wrapped around the finger of a billionaire's son who had collapsed without warning into the very heart of her quiet life. And something inside her whispered with certainty that this was not chance. This was the beginning. The waiting room felt like a cathedral of quiet tension, polished marble floors stretching beneath pristine white walls. tall windows letting in columns of afternoon light that gleamed across glass surfaces and the glossy covers of untouched magazines. Ava sat hunched in a corner chair, her apron balled in her lap, her hands stained faintly with coffee and wine. Around her, the air buzzed not with voices, but with presence. Well-dressed men and women flowed in like a tide of silk and cologne, each one glancing toward the double doors at the far end, where security now stood posted. Reporters clustered just outside the entrance, cameras pressed to the glass, waiting for any glimpse or statement. A nurse at the front desk murmured updates into a phone, while a man in a crisp suit murmured to a woman with diamond-studded earrings that it was Eli Carrington in that room. The name hit Ava like a shiver. She had heard of the Carringtons. Everyone had. Owners of chains, resorts, shipping lines. Their legacy was carved into the skyline. And yet, all she could see was that ring. Eli Carrington. A name that lived in headlines and stock tickers, now tangled with hers because of a childhood trinket that should not have survived a fire, much less ended up on the hand of a stranger. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the floor as she shifted, feeling the worn rubber edges curl up in shame against the glossy stone. Every detail of the room whispered affluence, from the orchids placed perfectly beside a tray of imported water bottles to the faint scent of lavender in the air, carefully filtered and designed to soothe. But Ava could not be soothed. Her thoughts churned in loops. How had he come to have the ring? Why did he wear it like it belonged to him? A security guard walked past and paused a moment too long beside her. She straightened but said nothing, offering only a small nod. He moved on. She realized she had not told anyone who she was or why she was still there. She had no reason to be, not officially, and yet every time she stood to leave, her knees locked. The door was right there, but her past was behind the other one. She did not know Eli Carrington. Had never heard his voice or seen his face before that moment at the restaurant, but now she was tethered to him by something deeper than chance, a memory, a fire, a lost ring that had no business still existing. She folded her arms across her chest as a nurse stepped out of the secured hallway with a clipboard. Ava's name was not called. She was invisible here, an intruder in a palace. And yet something kept her rooted to the spot. Some instinct, buried and patient, told her that this lobby, this moment, this encounter was a door to the truth, and she was not leaving until it opened. Ava had nearly convinced herself to leave when a soft voice called her name. She turned to see a nurse in pale blue scrubs walking toward her. Clipboard tucked beneath one arm, expression curious but kind. The nurse explained that the young man, Eli Carrington, had asked to speak with the waitress who helped him. Ava hesitated, her heartbeat pulsing at her throat. She followed the nurse through a quiet corridor lined with abstract art and diffused lights, each step carrying her deeper into a world that felt borrowed. They stopped at a tall white door. The nurse gave a gentle nod, then left. Ava stood alone for a moment, her hand on the doorframe, the silence pressing in. When she entered, the room was a gentle white cocoon, flooded with soft afternoon light that filtered through floor-length curtains. White lilies rested in tall glass vases by the window, their fragrance subtle but heavy, like the kind used at memorials. Machines beeped in slow rhythm, not intrusive but present, like a mechanical heartbeat keeping time with a story yet to unfold. Eli lay against a stack of pillows, his skin still pale but his eyes open and fixed on her as if he had been waiting. He looked younger now, the sharp edges of his public image softened by vulnerability and confusion. His voice was rough but curious as he asked if they had met before. Ava hesitated, her lips parted slightly, but instinct pulled her back. No, she said quietly. They had not met. He studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to decide if he believed her. She kept her eyes mostly on his face, but could not help the way they flicked toward his hand, where the silver ring rested against the pale blanket. It caught the light, tiny star still visible, and her breath faltered. Eli noticed. His gaze dropped to the ring, then back to her. A question hovered between them, unspoken but loud. He said he had worn it for as long as he could remember, though he never knew where it came from. A gift, maybe, from before he was adopted. He added that he had no memories from before the age of 4. Ava nodded slowly, her stomach tightening, her mind racing to keep her expression still. The room felt too quiet, too intimate for what neither of them could yet say. The air between them thickened with a quiet recognition neither could name. Ava forced a soft smile, said she was glad he was all right, and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, Eli's voice followed her. Asking her name, she gave it, just barely louder than a whisper. Their eyes met one last time. Something passed between them, not yet shaped into words, but both felt the weight of it settle. Ava stepped back into the hall, her fingers brushing her pocket where a faded photo still hid. The truth had stirred. It was not done with either of them yet. The city shimmered around her as Ava walked, its glass towers glowing like frozen fire under the street lamps, their reflections dancing across polished sidewalks and taxi hoods. Traffic pulsed softly beside her, and the occasional gust of autumn wind caught the hem of her coat, but she moved as if detached from it all, her mind far from the hum of life that buzzed around her. Her footsteps slowed as she neared the crosswalk near 5th and Alder, a corner that smelled faintly of roasted peanuts and exhaust, and without warning, memory surged forward. The sound came first. A crack, sharp and splitting, then heat, smoke. Her small hands clutching a silver ring so tightly it pressed into her palm, her fingers curled around it with a child's defiance, as if holding on would keep everything from falling apart. A flash of red. Her mother's voice, distant. Then nothing. Just a long stretch of cold white ceiling and the hollow echo of strange voices calling her, "Ava, Ava, this is your new home now." She blinked hard, pulling herself back to the present as the light changed and she crossed the street, the past lingering like smoke in her lungs. She had been told the fire was accidental, that her parents had not made it, that no relatives had been found, but she had never let go of the feeling that none of it added up. There were photos, tucked in the corners of a shoebox in her closet, faded snapshots of smiling faces, but no names, no dates. A woman with long hair who looked like her, a boy with a crooked grin and a birthmark on his cheek. For years, she had searched for someone who could tell her what those pictures meant, and now, in one impossible flash, the ring had returned. She reached her apartment, a small 2-room unit above a florist's shop, its warmth familiar, but tired. The stairs creaked, the door stuck. Inside, she flicked on a lamp and let the golden light spill across the worn rug and the dented coffee table stacked with second-hand books. On the wall, 3 photographs hung in mismatched frames. She stared at the one on the far right, a younger version of herself, standing in front of a tree, smiling in the sun, her hand slightly outstretched. If she looked close, just barely, she could make out the same silver ring. Her chest tightened. She crossed to the closet, pulled down the shoebox, and lifted the lid. More pictures. More questions. She traced her fingers along the edges of the photos, lips pressed in a thin line, and then slowly looked up at her own reflection in the small hallway mirror. Her expression had changed. The ache was still there, but something else had taken root. A quiet determination. The truth was not gone. It had simply been waiting. She had seen it in that hospital room, on the hand of a stranger, and she would not let it slip away again. The night passed in fragments of restless sleep and glowing screen light as Ava sat curled on her thrifted couch, laptop balanced on her knees, searching through page after page of carefully curated articles and hidden local reports. She started with Eli Carrington's name, which led quickly to a polished public biography. Heir to Carrington International, known for his work with the Carrington Foundation, a darling of business magazines and social pages. But she scrolled past the glossy headlines and found a line buried in an old profile from nearly 15 years ago. Adopted at the age of 3 after surviving a house fire that claimed the lives of his biological parents. The words lit something behind her eyes. Found alone. Fire. No known relatives. The world around her went still. She read the line again, then again, her fingers trembling just slightly against the keyboard. She reached for her phone and pulled up the photograph she had taken of her childhood self from the box last night. There she was, no more than 5, hair in uneven braids, grinning beside a tree, her hand extended toward the lens, with that same silver ring catching the light. She stared at it, her breath shallow. That ring, that fire, that boy. She didn't know how, but the pieces were beginning to speak to each other. The next morning, under the sterile fluorescent lights of the restaurant's employee lounge, Ava sat at the small table near the lockers with the photo in her hand, her apron still tied loosely around her waist, her shift set to begin in minutes. She was surrounded by the low hum of chatter, clinking coffee cups, and the scent of strong brew, but her mind was far from the buzz of daily routine. She traced the curve of the ring in the photo with her finger, her brows drawn in deep thought. Could Eli have been there that night? Could they have been found at the same fire, taken by different people, told different truths? She remembered how quickly she had been removed from the hospital as a child, placed into care, how the questions she asked were met with distraction or silence. She had always assumed it was because there were no answers. Now she wondered if someone had simply chosen not to give them. Her shift manager called her name, and she slipped the photo back into her pocket, but something had shifted. The quiet weight she had always carried was no longer just a memory. It had become a map. She no longer doubted that something had been taken from her that night, that the answers had not been lost but hidden. She was not a child anymore. She had a voice, a will, and the courage to follow the thread. The ring had returned for a reason. Whatever truth it pointed to, she would find it, no matter what it cost, no matter who wanted it buried. The next day, Ava stood once more in the pale hallway of the private hospital wing, the same cool air brushing past her as it had before, though this time her steps were more certain, her hand clenched tightly around the faded photograph in her coat pocket. The nurse at the desk glanced up and nodded, remembering her. No words were exchanged. The corridor ahead gleamed with quiet purpose, and the lilies from yesterday still bloomed just inside Eli's room when she entered. He was awake, sitting up straighter now, less pale but more guarded. She moved slowly, her voice soft as she greeted him, and when he nodded, she stepped forward and held out the photo without explanation. Eli took it with one hand, his brows furrowing, and the silence grew deep as he studied it. His eyes moved to her, then back to the image, his face going still. He whispered that the ring in the photo looked exactly like his. Ava nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. Eli looked down at his hand, turning it slightly in the quiet light, then back at her with a strange mix of hesitation and vulnerability. He admitted that he had no memory of anything before he was about 4, that his earliest recollections were of being in a strange room, a man in a suit telling him he was safe now, that he would be taken care of. The ring had been on his finger already, and no one knew where it had come from. They assumed it was from his past, and so he had kept it, worn it, always, maybe as a way to hold on to something he could not remember. Ava's throat tightened as she listened. The photo lay between them now like an open door. The room itself, filled with soft beeping and filtered light, felt quieter than before, the sharp white softened by the diffused glow of mid-morning sun pressing through sheer curtains. She moved to sit in the chair beside his bed, something unspoken pulling her to stay longer. Eli looked at her again, his voice low as he asked if she believed they knew each other, if she thought they had been connected somehow. Ava hesitated. She could have told him everything right then, spilled the memory of the fire, the way she had held the ring, the sudden fracture of her life after that night. But she said only that she believed this ring and this photo were not coincidences, that something had been hidden, and they were meant to find it. Eli nodded slowly, the lines on his face softening. For the first time, he did not look like the man from the headlines, the heir, the icon. He looked like someone lost, someone reaching toward a truth too long denied. And Ava, despite everything, felt something shift. Not just the mystery deepening, but a quiet bond forming. Two strangers with matching scars and a shared silence they were only beginning to understand. The invitation came with a hesitant tone and eyes that did not quite meet hers, but Eli said it mattered, that the gala might offer a chance to learn more, to stir loose pieces that had long been cemented into silence. Ava accepted, though the idea of walking into a Carrington event left her throat dry and her heart rattling like a drawer half open. She borrowed a dress from her neighbor upstairs, a silky midnight blue that clung too softly to her frame and didn't quite hide the discomfort in her shoulders. The car sent for her was long, black, and silent inside. The driver did not speak. When she stepped out in front of the Carrington estate, her breath caught. The mansion stretched like something out of a forgotten novel, all white stone and towering windows, its rooflines lit with golden light, and its massive entrance flanked by 2 fountains that whispered over marble. She climbed the steps slowly, aware of every step, every unfamiliar shimmer of her earrings, every glance from guests who looked polished and effortless. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and expensive perfume. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and the walls were dressed with framed oil paintings and fresh flowers. A string quartet played in a sunken living room repurposed as a ballroom. Ava felt like a ghost slipping through a world too glossy to hold fingerprints. She spotted Eli across the room, surrounded by guests, his tuxedo fitting perfectly, his smile polite and distant. But before she could reach him, a man approached. Robert Carrington. Introduced as Eli's godfather and longtime family advisor, he was tall, perfectly groomed, with silver at his temples and a face carved into polite interest. He greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and asked about her work with a curiosity too pointed to be casual. His voice was low, his tone perfectly balanced between charm and something colder. He mentioned that Eli often acted on impulse, that the foundation welcomed all types of supporters, and that it was always refreshing to see new faces. Ava nodded and answered carefully, but she felt the weight of his gaze, the way his attention lingered just a second too long on the ring around her neck, now threaded through a chain for the evening. He asked about it, casually, and she said it was a family piece. He smiled again and said nothing more, but the air between them chilled. As he stepped away, the perfume of roses and varnish did nothing to warm her. She stood for a moment, unsure of whether she had just been welcomed or warned. Around her, laughter swirled like smoke, waiters moved with trays of champagne, and the music shifted to something slower. Ava turned and caught Eli's eye at last. He crossed to her, and for the first time that evening, she felt the ground beneath her steady just slightly. But behind them, Robert watched from across the room, still smiling, still silent. The night moved around Ava like a current, pulling her between faces she did not recognize, and conversations that felt too light, too rehearsed, too far removed from the truth she had come to find. Eli had been called away to speak on behalf of the foundation, leaving her alone again amid crystal chandeliers and whispered social maneuvering. She slipped away quietly, her steps barely echoing on the marble floor as she moved down a side hallway lined with family portraits and curated perfection. Her fingers brushed along the edge of the frame that held Eli's childhood photo, the one used in every magazine article, but now it looked different. He looked different. She reached the door to the Carrington study and tried the handle. Unlocked. The room was a world apart from the glittering ballroom. It smelled of leather and dust and aged paper, its walls lined with books and closed secrets. A heavy desk sat near the window, lit by a single brass lamp. Ava stepped in, her pulse tightening, her instincts louder than her breath. She opened the drawers one by one until she found a thin folder labeled Foster Transfer. Her hands moved quickly, reverently, flipping through the brittle papers. There it was. Fire. Child found alone. Age estimated between 3 and 4. No confirmed identity. Transferred to Carrington guardianship within 1 week. No further inquiry. Her breath caught as she read the details. The location, the date. It matched her own memory, her own fire. She pulled out her phone and snapped photos quickly, her fingers trembling. She paused on a second form, a name redacted in thick ink, a signature that looked familiar but she could not place. Just as she leaned in closer, the door creaked open. Ava froze. Robert stepped inside, silent, his expression calm but unreadable. He closed the door behind him and said nothing at first, only walked to the desk, adjusted a paperweight, and then looked at her with the calm of someone long practiced in control. He told her she should not be here, that curiosity could be dangerous in houses built on legacy. His words were soft, unhurried, but each one carried weight. He said Eli was kind, open-hearted, and far too willing to trust those with soft eyes and heavy intentions. He warned her that pasts were buried for a reason, and that not every mystery needed solving. Ava stood her ground, chin high, the file still open behind her. She said she was only looking for the truth. He smiled at that, said truth had a way of getting people hurt. especially those who came from nothing and tried to stir the lives of those born into everything. Ava didn't reply. She held his gaze until he turned, adjusted his cuff, and left the room without another word. The door clicked behind him like the closing of a vault. She stood alone, the air colder now, the silence heavier. But the truth was no longer a shadow, it had a shape, and a guardian who clearly wanted it kept in the dark. Ava stepped back into the glow of the ballroom like someone returning from a different world, the noise and color of the gala pressing in too loudly after the hush of the study. Her chest was tight, her hand still slightly shaking from the quiet war of words with Robert, and every face around her seemed too composed, too removed from the weight she now carried. She spotted Eli across the room, his tuxedo sharp beneath the lights, but his eyes found hers before she could take another step. He moved through the crowd quickly, concern flickering in every line of his face. When he reached her, he didn't ask what was wrong. He only guided her toward the nearest terrace door with a gentleness that gave her room to breathe. Outside, the evening air was cooler than expected, laced with the scent of roses climbing the garden walls. The music behind them grew muffled, a distant echo of wealth and performance, while the truth stood naked between them under the open sky. Ava turned toward him, every instinct screaming to hold it back, to protect herself the way she always had, but something cracked open instead. She told him quietly, almost breathlessly, that she believed they were once part of the same family, that the fire that took his past also burned through hers, that the ring he wore had once belonged to her. She paused, watching the disbelief wash over his face. He blinked slowly, his posture shifting as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He asked her to say it again. She did. And this time he did not interrupt. For a long moment he said nothing at all, just looked out at the moonlight scattered across the manicured garden, and whispered that he had always felt like something was missing, like a part of himself had never been named, that he remembered waking up in a strange house with no comfort, only silence, that the ring had been the only thing that felt like it belonged to him. Ava's breath trembled as she listened, her own past filling the spaces between his words. She told him about the photos she had found, the scar she carried, the nights she lay awake wondering why she had survived and who she had left behind. He turned to her slowly then, his eyes searching hers not for answers but for recognition, as if the child he once was still lived behind her gaze. And in that quiet, between the garden's stillness and the party's hum, something shifted between them. No longer strangers, not yet siblings, but two lives woven by a thread they had both carried in silence for too long. Eli reached out without thinking, his fingers brushing hers just lightly, grounding himself in this moment. Neither of them said the word family. They didn't need to. It was already breathing in the space between them, fragile but alive. The following morning, Eli sat alone in the back seat of his town car as the driver navigated the quieter, older part of the city, far from the mirrored towers and gala lights. His hands rested tightly in his lap, the silver ring colder than usual against his skin. He had not slept. Ava's words had lived in his thoughts like a quiet drumbeat, steady and undeniable. Every hour since she had spoken them had only sharpened the feeling that something long buried was beginning to rise. The car pulled up to a modest office building of dark brick and brass plaques, and Eli stepped out into a silence, broken only by the sound of pigeons shifting on the roof above. Inside, the law offices of Greer and Associates smelled of dust, old ink, and lemon polish. Eli was greeted with cautious respect, then led through narrow hallways to a private room lined with books. There, behind a heavy walnut desk, sat Charles Greer, the Carringtons' family attorney for over 3 decades. The man rose stiffly to greet him, his manner polished, eyes sharp beneath silver brows. After pleasantries faded, Eli asked directly about the fire, the adoption, and the early records of his arrival into the Carrington family. Greer paused. His expression shifted just slightly, like a curtain drawn half an inch. He admitted there had always been irregularities. The report submitted at the time had missing details. No one questioned it too deeply, Greer added, because Robert handled everything quickly, privately, and with full authority from the late Mr. Carrington. Greer said there was a sealed file, one kept under protective order due to a clause in the guardianship agreement. That file, he said, could not be opened without Robert Carrington's direct consent. Eli felt a slow heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but something weightier, like betrayal dressed in quiet realization. He asked why he hadn't been told about any of this before. Greer looked at him carefully and said he had always assumed Eli knew that Robert was handling it as family business. The word family rang hollow. Eli stood, thanked him without warmth, and left the building with his mind already racing. In the car, his reflection flickered in the glass, his features lined with a tension he rarely let surface. For so long, he had moved through the world with effortless charm, fulfilling expectations with the practiced ease of someone raised to represent something greater than himself. But now he saw how carefully that image had been shaped. The lines in the mirror no longer showed the heir. They showed the son who had been lied to, the man who had begun asking his own questions. And for the first time in years, Eli Carrington was no longer waiting for answers to find him. He was ready to go looking. The road back to the foster home felt both impossibly long and heartbreakingly familiar, each turn stirring fragments of memory Ava thought had long faded. She had not been here in over a decade, not since she aged out of the system and set out on her own, carrying more questions than possessions. The building stood where it always had, a squat, square house, with peeling white paint and sun-faded wind chimes swaying gently from the porch. The neighborhood had changed little. Bicycles leaned against fences, dogs barked behind chain links, and laundry fluttered like flags of ordinary life. She knocked softly, unsure who might still be there, and was surprised when a woman with kind eyes and silver hair answered. Mrs. Lorna had once been the daytime caretaker, her gentle humming and firm guidance woven into Ava's earliest years of confusion. She blinked in recognition and invited her in without hesitation, leading her through a narrow hallway still lined with crayon artwork and faded growth charts. They sat in the kitchen where the afternoon sun poured through gingham curtains, casting warm patterns across the table. Ava explained why she had come. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the fire, the ring, the boy she now believed had once shared her past. Mrs. Lorna listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a chipped tea mug, then slowly set it down and said there was something she had always wondered if she should share. She remembered Ava's arrival after the fire, burned, frightened, clutching a ring so tightly it had to be pried from her hand. She remembered that another woman had survived the fire, barely, but with no memory of who she was or who she had lost. For years, the system had marked her as a Jane Doe. She had been moved to a care facility under a new name when no relatives came forward. Ava's breath hitched. She asked the woman's name now. Mrs. Lorna said she did not know her current identity, only that the paperwork had been sealed. The moment hung in the sunlit kitchen like a held breath. Ava felt her pulse throb behind her eyes. Her mother, not gone, not burned to nothing, just lost, misnamed, erased. She stood slowly, walking to the window, eyes fixed on nothing as her thoughts tumbled. 1,000 possibilities opened all at once. The ring, the fire, the boy. The stories she had been told no longer held. What if her mother had been looking for her this entire time, from inside a life she didn't remember? She turned back to Mrs. Lorna and asked gently if there was any way to trace where that woman had gone. The older woman said perhaps there were still records, perhaps in storage. Ava nodded, a resolve settling behind her ribs. The house around her smelled of cinnamon and dust, its warmth a strange comfort against the sharpness of her grief. For the first time, the shadows that had followed her since childhood felt like they might be lifting. She was not done losing. She was just beginning to find. The park was nearly empty as the sun slipped behind the skyline, casting long golden streaks across the grass and turning the fountain at its center into a pool of flickering light. Ava sat on a low stone bench beneath an old tree, her coat pulled tightly around her, fingers twisting the hem as she waited. She had not known if Eli would come. She had sent only a short message, no explanation, just a time and a place. But he did. He appeared like a shadow melting into color, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his face lined with something quieter than worry but heavier than calm. They sat together without speaking at first, letting the hush of dusk settle between them. The sounds of distant traffic softened by wind. Then slowly, cautiously, they began to share. Ava told him about the foster home, the caretaker, the woman with no name who had survived the fire and vanished behind paperwork and silence. Eli listened, his brows drawn, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Then he spoke of his visit to the attorney, of the sealed document, of Robert's quiet control over every locked truth. Their voices lowered to match the light around them. Words came softer now, as if spoken too loudly they might break the fragile trust growing between them. Finally, Ava turned to him and pulled back the sleeve of her coat, revealing a small scar near her elbow, pale but clearly etched. She said she had gotten it in the fire. She remembered being pulled through glass. She remembered crying for someone, for a boy. Eli went still. He reached up slowly and unbuttoned the cuff of his shirt, rolling it to reveal the inside of his forearm. There, almost in the same place, was a scar, slightly curved, like a half-moon. They stared at each other, breath held. Eli said he remembered glass, too, a hand holding his, a voice screaming his name. Ava whispered that she had always thought it was a dream, a trick of smoke and memory. But it was real. It had to be. The silence between them shifted, no longer empty. It pulsed with something known and old and broken and beautiful. The wind rustled the leaves above them. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Neither of them moved. They just sat there, no longer strangers, no longer merely curious. Something deeper had risen. Not answers, not yet, but a recognition, a scar shared, a memory mirrored, a feeling that they were, in some inescapable way, part of the same beginning. Eli looked at her, and for the first time in his life felt the ache of not knowing replaced by the fragile relief of being seen. Ava met his gaze and felt a calm settle in her chest, even as the questions remained. Whatever came next, They would face it together, not just because they had to, but because, finally, they were not alone. The Carrington estate looked different now. As Ava and Eli approached its towering gates together, the evening casting long shadows across the driveway, lined with manicured hedges and pale marble statues that seemed to watch with silent judgment. They said little as they walked through the grand entryway, escorted without fanfare to Robert's private study at the back of the house, the same room where Ava had once stood in secret and felt the walls breathe with hidden truths. Now the air was still and cold. Robert stood by the tall window when they entered, his hands clasped behind his back, a glass of something dark resting on a nearby side table. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable but composed, eyes settling first on Eli, then on Ava. There was no surprise in his face, only weariness and calculation. Eli spoke first, voice steady but tight, asking if it was true. If he had been separated from his real family, if Ava was his sister. Robert did not flinch. He walked to the desk, poured himself a drink without asking. Then, Saturday, he said yes, calmly, almost casually. He confirmed that Eli had been found with a girl in the wreckage of the fire, that the ring had belonged to her, that her identity had been unknown at the time, and that the Carrington name could not risk the complication of a low-born child connected to its legacy. He said the girl was handed over to the state while Eli was taken in, rebranded and protected. The family had insisted on preserving the illusion of clean bloodlines and perfect origins. Ava stared at him, heart hammering, trying to decide which part of him to hate first. Eli's jaw tightened as he asked if their mother had survived. Robert nodded, yes, but she was unstable, disoriented, lost to her own past. He had arranged for her to be placed in long-term care under a different name, far from the media and the Carrington legacy. The words dropped like stones. Ava stepped forward, voice shaking but firm, asking how he could do that, how he could erase an entire family without hesitation. Robert looked at her with the kind of pity that burns more than cruelty. He said, the world was built on sacrifices, that some names carry weight and some do not, that he had protected Eli from a life of obscurity and scandal, that he had done what was necessary. Eli's voice cut through the room then, low and sharp, saying that nothing justifies what was stolen. Not legacy, not money, not fear. Robert sighed, leaned back in his chair, and said softly that the truth changes nothing. But Eli disagreed, because for the first time he understood what had been done in his name, and he would not carry it forward. Ava stood beside him, her presence quiet but resolute. The lies were no longer hidden in shadows. They stood now in the light, and Robert Carrington, with all his power and poise, looked suddenly very small. The tension still lingered in the room like smoke as Ava stepped closer to Robert's desk, her voice low but sharper than it had ever been. She told him she wanted to see her mother, not a report, not a record. The woman, alive, breathing, now. Robert's hands folded, unfazed, but Eli stepped forward too, stating that if the Carrington name was worth protecting, then it was also worth being honest, and if Robert refused, they would take what they had to the press, to the board, to the world. The threat cracked through the last of Robert's defenses. With a tired sigh and a resigned glance toward a locked drawer, he pulled out a thin file. The name listed on the cover was unfamiliar, an alias, but the photo inside was not. Older now, worn and lined by time, but unmistakably the same face from Ava's hidden childhood photos. Hours later, the car turned down a narrow wooded road leading to a small private care home tucked between trees and silence. The building was humble, a single story painted in soft green, its porch wrapped in ivy and wind chimes. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and tea. A nurse led them through quiet halls until they reached a sunlit room at the end, where a woman sat by the window, staring out at a bird feeder. Her hair was long, streaked with silver, her posture gentle but detached. She did not turn as they entered. Ava stood frozen just inside the doorway, Eli beside her, both hesitant to break the stillness. The nurse called the woman by her alias. She turned slowly, her eyes drifting over them like passing clouds. No spark of recognition, no alarm, just a quiet gaze, curious but empty. Ava stepped forward, her hands trembling, and removed the silver ring from the chain around her neck. She knelt beside the chair and held it out silently, palms open. The woman looked down. For a moment, nothing changed. Then her breath caught. Her eyes widened just slightly, and her fingers reached forward on instinct, brushing the ring like it was made of glass. Her hand trembled as she touched it again, then again, and a sound left her throat, small, unsure, but heavy with something ancient. A tear slid down her cheek. She looked at Ava, really looked, and though no words came, her hand lifted, tracing the air beside Ava's face. Her lips moved silently. Ava took her hand gently and held it there against her cheek, closing her eyes. The moment stretched, soft and holy, a connection flickering to life through the haze. Eli stood back, watching, his own throat tight. This was no full return, no movie-perfect awakening, but something had broken open, something that had been sealed by time and silence. And in that quiet room, beneath a sky turning gold with evening, Ava found the first piece of what had once been taken, not in words, but in touch, in tears, in memory, waking slowly from sleep. The room held a kind of hush that felt different from silence. It was a quiet made of breath and heartbeat, and the weight of a moment too fragile to name. Ava still knelt beside the chair, her mother's hand resting lightly in hers, warm and delicate and real, while the silver ring shimmered faintly between their palms. Across the room, Eli stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes locked on the scene before him, but his mind drifting somewhere deeper. The truth had found shape now, but it had not settled. It trembled in his chest, raw and loud, pressing against the image of the life he thought he knew, his name, his history, the meaning behind every carefully curated moment of his childhood. And here, in a modest room tucked inside a quiet care home, stood the truth, not dressed in power or legacy, but in simplicity and love that had survived by instinct alone. Ava spoke softly, her voice steady but wrapped in the ache of all the years lost. She told her mother that she was not alone anymore, that her name was Ava, that she had always believed something was missing, someone was missing. She whispered that she had been looking without knowing, and now, finally, she had found her. Her mother did not respond with words, but her fingers closed more firmly around Ava's. Her gaze, still clouded by time and confusion, stayed focused on the ring. Her breathing deepened, like the rhythm of a memory returning not as a flood but as the trickle of something long frozen beginning to thaw. Ava promised her that this was not the end of their story, that she would take her home, care for her, hold what they had left, and rebuild what had been stolen. Behind her, Eli exhaled slowly. He had no words for what stirred in him, a guilt he could not place, a mourning for a life that had been rewritten before he could choose it, but also, somewhere beneath it all, a seed of hope. He stepped forward, carefully, and stood just beside them. Ava looked up at him, her eyes red but alive, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. No ceremony, no grand revelation, just presence, family. Real and tangled and bruised, but breathing again. The soft hum of wind moved through the open window. A bird chirped once, then flew off. The light in the room had turned golden, casting everything in a soft, forgiving warmth. It was not a full healing, it was not resolution, but it was a return, a beginning, and for the first time in 2 decades, the three of them existed in the same space, bound not by blood alone, but by survival, by the fragile, unbreakable thread of love that had waited patiently to be seen again. The morning air buzzed with the static hum of cameras and low murmurs as journalists clustered in rows across the manicured Carrington estate garden, their microphones and notebooks poised like weapons of ceremony. The fountain behind them gurgled softly, and the garden itself was in full bloom, lavender, white roses, trimmed hedges, and climbing ivy that wrapped the marble pillars in a quiet green embrace. In the center of it all stood Eli, no longer the polished face of the Carrington Empire, but something stripped down, sharpened, and real. The news had broken overnight, a leak. Documents once hidden, adoption records, the sealed fire report, mentions of a woman erased, and children separated. Whispers became headlines by morning, and now the name Carrington trended alongside betrayal and stolen family. Eli had called the press himself. Ava stood off to the side, beside their mother, whose expression was gentle but distant, her presence now fragile and sacred. Eli stepped to the microphone, a page folded in his hand, though he never once looked down at it. He began not with apology, but with truth. He said the Carrington legacy had been built on wealth and power, but that power had once come at the price of love, of family, of silence forced on the voiceless. He named Ava, named their mother, spoke of a fire that took their past but not their connection, of choices made in secret by men who believed image mattered more than humanity. And then he paused, took a breath, and said that moving forward, the name Carrington would mean something different. That if protecting the truth meant risking his position, his inheritance, even his name, then so be it, because he had seen what pretending costs. He had lived it. The garden around him shimmered in the soft gold of morning light. Birds stirred in the branches overhead. The press murmured but did not interrupt. There was something in his voice, his posture, that silenced spectacle. This was not a performance, it was a confession, a rebirth. He stepped back as the cameras flashed, and for a moment the world seemed to shift, not in thunder, but in the quiet movement of someone choosing honesty over empire. Ava watched him, something deep in her steadying at last. For so long, Eli had been the untouchable heir, the symbol of what her life could never reach. Now he stood not above her, but beside her. Not as a stranger, but as something far rarer. A brother. A man transformed not by power, but by the courage to give it up. Their mother's hand twitched lightly in hers, and Ava leaned down, whispering that they would be all right, that this was the beginning they had earned. And as the sun rose higher, casting warmth across the tangled garden, the truth no longer needed hiding. It bloomed, unashamed, in the open air. The room that had once belonged to Robert Carrington was now stripped of its power, though nothing physical had changed. The leather chairs still gleamed with polish, the desk sat heavy with importance, and the high shelves behind him still held volumes of legal books and Carrington family albums bound in gold. But the air was different now, thicker, heavier, and absent of the quiet control he once wore like a second skin. The board's decision had come swiftly, almost ruthlessly, following the press storm Eli ignited. With public trust at risk and scrutiny rising from all sides, they had no choice but to vote. Unanimous. Robert was removed as chief advisor, stripped of his influence, his title, his seat on the foundation he had once run with an iron grace. He had built the House of Carrington legacy with his own hands, or so he told himself, and now watched it redefine itself without him. He sat in the half-dark, blinds closed against the morning sun, fingers resting loosely on the edge of his now pointless appointment book. The silence was deafening. Not the calm quiet of calculated solitude, but the echoing absence of importance. No assistants knocked on his door, no calls rang through. His phone lay dark beside him, as forgotten as the legacy he tried to protect by tearing others apart. He reached for a glass of untouched whiskey, then set it back down. Across the room, a painting of the Carrington estate hung like a reminder of a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. Footsteps broke the silence, soft, steady. He looked up as Ava appeared in the doorway. She did not pause, did not slow. She only walked past him, her shoulders straight, her eyes forward, the silver ring glinting softly at her neck, like a memory reclaimed. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence held more judgment than any speech could carry. Robert watched her go, the sound of her heels fading into the hallway like the closing of a book he would never finish. In that moment, he understood fully what he had lost. Not just power, but the illusion that control was enough, that wealth could protect against truth, that legacy was stronger than love. The office around him, once a fortress, now felt like a mausoleum, every object a relic, every shadow a reminder. He leaned back in the leather chair that no longer mattered and stared at the closed door. The truth had walked through that room, uninvited and unafraid, and it had left him behind. The modest apartment above the florist's shop had always felt small to Ava, a stopgap between chapters, a quiet place to rest while the world outside rushed forward. But now, as she stood in the doorway helping her mother over the threshold, the space breathed with new meaning. It was no longer a pause in her life. It was a beginning. Her mother moved slowly, eyes wandering the walls as though trying to place herself among them. Ava had spent the past week carefully transforming the space. The couch had been moved closer to the window to catch the afternoon sunday. The coffee table was cleared of books to make room for tea and puzzle pieces, and the walls were lined with taped-up photographs, childhood pictures of Ava, some newly restored, others grainy and fading. In one, a girl with wild hair grinned from a backyard swing. In another, a woman with gentle eyes held a baby close, her face turned toward the light. Her mother stared at that photo the longest. She didn't speak, but her fingers brushed the edge of the frame every time she passed it. It was not full memory, but it was something, a touch point, a root. Ava kept things gentle, slow, and honest. Music played softly in the mornings, soup simmered on the stove in the evenings, and they sat together each night as Ava read from books her mother once loved. Stories about sisters, about family, about finding home again. Eli came by often. At first, he arrived with his usual charm, crisp shirts, and cautious questions. But over time, he began to soften in the quiet of Ava's space. He brought groceries. He helped rearrange the closet. He sat on the floor building puzzles beside their mother, his shoes kicked off, his sleeves rolled up. The man who once stood as a symbol of wealth and power now knelt on a threadbare rug and laughed when a puzzle piece fit. He asked Ava about her favorite books growing up, about the scar on her arm, about the scent of the candles she kept near the windowsill. And sometimes, when their mother had dozed off in the early evening light, they would sit together at the kitchen table, their knees touching beneath it, saying little but feeling everything. There was something between them, not loud, not spoken, but present. The bond of shared blood, yes, but also something else, something tentative. Neither of them moved toward it, and neither of them moved away. It hung there like a song waiting for the right note. For now, Ava allowed it to exist without shape. She had her mother back. She had her brother. The apartment glowed with the warmth of a healing world. The chipped counters and crooked floorboards no longer mattered. What mattered was that every corner now held laughter, every wall held memory, and every silence held peace instead of ache. For the first time in years, Ava was not just surviving, she was home. The restaurant was just as she remembered it, with its golden chandeliers casting soft pools of light on white linen and polished cutlery, but something in the air felt different as Ava stepped inside for one final shift. The familiar scent of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen, waitstaff bustled past with trays held high, and jazz curled like smoke through the background. Yet eyes followed her now, not in judgment or dismissal, but in quiet recognition. A couple near the window offered a warm nod. A man at the bar lifted his glass slightly in silent respect. Word had spread. Through headlines, through whispered stories, through the undeniable power of truth when it finally rises. Ava tied her apron with steady hands, buttoned her collar, and moved through the dining room with the ease of someone who had once been invisible in this space, now seen fully for who she was. She refilled a glass of water at table 6 when a tug at her side pulled her attention downward. A young girl, no more than 7, stood beside her with wide eyes and braided hair. She pointed shyly to the silver ring that hung from a chain around Ava's neck, catching the light with every step she took. The girl asked if it was special. Ava crouched down slowly, her smile gentle, her eyes soft. She told her that every ring carries a story, that sometimes they get lost, but the best ones find their way back. The girl listened like it was magic. In a way, it was. Ava looked up then and caught her own reflection in the polished brass of the wine cabinet. She didn't see the waitress who had once moved unnoticed between tables, surviving on tips and long hours. She saw a woman who had uncovered a legacy buried in silence, who had reclaimed a family thought lost, who had brought light into places long left dark. She was still wearing the same uniform, but she was not the same person. Her story had changed, and because of that, so had others. She stood and walked back to the kitchen, her steps slow, her heart full. every corner of the restaurant now a page in the chapter she had just closed. The chef waved as she passed. One of the hosts offered her a rose left over from the centerpieces. She tucked it behind her ear. The shift moved on with its quiet rhythm, orders placed and delivered, laughter weaving through table conversations. But Ava walked through it all with the grace of someone who had come full circle. She knew she wouldn't return again, not in this role, not in this way. And that was okay, because this place, once just a job, had been the beginning of something far bigger. And now, as the ring around her neck caught one last glint of light, Ava knew that stories never end where they start. They bloom slowly, quietly, and sometimes exactly where you least expect. The apartment was quiet in the way only peace can be, no longer hollow, but full of presence, of breath, of life that had finally found its place again. The table sat near the window, small and slightly wobbly, its surface nicked from years of use, now covered with mismatched mugs and a plate of sliced apples. Sunlight poured through the glass in golden sheets, casting gentle halos around the three figures seated together. Ava sat closest to the window, her hand resting lightly on her mother's wrist as the older woman smiled faintly at something Eli had just said. He was laughing softly, leaning in, his posture relaxed and real, a far cry from the man who once moved through gala halls with practiced charm and distant eyes. Their mother, still quiet most days, now hummed under her breath as she traced the rim of her mug, her fingers brushing the edge of a photo Ava had pinned to the nearby wall. A photo of the three of them taken just last week. It wasn't perfect. Her expression was uncertain. Eli's tie was crooked. Ava's eyes were half closed in laughter, but it was theirs. They sat in a triangle of light, the kind that wrapped around them like a quiet blessing, their silhouettes soft, their shadows intertwined across the wood grain of the floor. The ring, once lost and worn by a stranger, now hung in the center of the table, resting on a small dish beside a folded napkin, not forgotten, but no longer needed to prove anything. What had begun as a mystery hidden in plain sight had become a family remade through fragments and faith. The window behind them framed the world like a painting, the city moving beyond it, unaware of the miracle unfolding in one small room above a flower shop. A bird landed briefly on the sill, then lifted again into the open air. In that stillness, in that light, everything broken had not been fixed, but had been seen, held, and given space to become something new. The past had been uncovered, and the future stretched forward, unwritten but no longer feared. Then, as the screen slowly began to fade, a voice rose, not loud, not dramatic, but soft and certain. It reminded us that sometimes the smallest things, a photograph, a scar, a silver ring, carry the truths we spend lifetimes chasing. That what is lost is not always gone. That what is forgotten still waits to be found. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the ordinary opens the door to something extraordinary. As the last rays of light filled the room, and the final shot lingered on the three figures at the table, laughing, quiet, whole. The voice reminded us gently that every story, no matter how hidden, wants to come home. If this story moved you, even in the smallest way, let it be known. Give it a like, and leave a comment below. We read every single one. It helps us bring more real, emotional stories like this to those who need them most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter in a journey just like Ava's. Share this with someone who feels forgotten, someone who's been searching for answers. Because sometimes the missing piece isn't gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Thank you for being part of this story.